on this edition of the Correspondents.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Tough talk from the U.S. president and escalating prospects for a military clash after North Korea threatens to launch a missile strike against a U.S. territory. With temperatures rising, South Koreans watch and wait, along with the people of Japan, the only country to experience the horrors of a nuclear attack. All this as the new administration faces its biggest foreign policy test yet, a test that comes just as President Trump's credibility hits new lows. Hello and welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. On this special edition of the Correspondents, we take a closer look at roiling tensions around the globe as a result of the escalating war of words between the United States and North Korea. Pyongyang this week announcing plans to launch a missile strike on the U.S. Pacific territory of Guam. This coming just hours after U.S. President Trump made his now infamous fire and fury comments. Experts warn, however, that even a limited U.S. strike against North Korea could lead to a deadly counterattack in the south. VOA's Brian Padden reports from Seoul.
In the best-case scenario, a limited U.S. preemptive strike on a missile launch site or nuclear facility would not seriously degrade North Korea's capabilities, but it may convince the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, to seek dialogue rather than risk a war he knows he cannot win.
If he stays patient and tries to find an exit through negotiations with the U.S. using China and Russia, he may stay alive.
However, the very justification for military action to eliminate the North's nuclear threat is that the aggressive leadership in Pyongyang cannot be counted on to act with restraint.
So there seems to be a disconnect between saying Kim Jong-un is crazy and might launch an attack, but he would be rational enough not to respond to a U.S. attack.
And so the potentially deadly chess game continues. Joining us now to talk about what might happen next, we are joined on Skype from the U.S. Naval Base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, and right here in Washington by VOA News Center's Bill Gallo. I thank you both for joining us. Carla, nice location you've got there. Tell us what's going on at Pearl Harbor.
It's been very busy here on the island. In fact, Secretary Tillerson just left, and General Joe Dunford, the top U.S. general in the United States, just arrived. He's going to be speaking with the commander of Pacific Command, talking about what are the options, the military options for the North Korea crisis. Keep in mind, the North Korea crisis, everyone has said that the military option is a last resort, but they have to look at all the options. The general is also going to be asking about China. China is a very important stop on the general's trip to Asia, and he is going to be looking for how they can bridge the gap, because I was talking to a Pacific Command official who said that it's kind of a mixed bag with U.S.-Chinese military relations. So they're going to want to find out what they can do in common to tackle this threat.
So, Carla, is Hawaii technically a potential target, or is it just a strategic supply point? What role is it going to play in the upcoming war games, or whatever the likelihood might be, depending on what goes on over there in the Korean Peninsula?
Well, North Korea has said that they can strike the United States. So the U.S. military has to take North Korea at its word. Whether or not that's true or not is yet to be determined. We saw those missile launches on July 4th and July 28th. Some experts have told me that the one on July 28th, while it did fly farther, it did not seem to make it all the way back with reentry. It looked like it may have burned up in reentry, so they may not have that capability yet to reach the United States.
Right.
But Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, they're all on high alert right now. And Pearl Harbor Pacific Command headquarters is going to be crucial for any sort of reaction that the U.S. military makes in Asia.
So, Bill, regarding what Carla said about the technical deficiencies that still exist, a more likely target is going to be Guam. Why is Guam such a strategic target for Pyongyang?
Well, the first reason is that it's closer to Korea. In fact, it's the closest U.S. territory to Asia. It's about 3,000 kilometers or so from Korea, which makes it an easier target. Let's face it, there are several missiles that North Korea possesses that are capable in theory of hitting Guam. Now, in practice, we don't know because they haven't been used in combat. They've been tested. But we don't know they could use them to hit Guam, and we don't know how much damage they could do because there's also a little dispute over the capabilities it has as it relates to weapons.
It would take a matter of minutes to hit Guam, wouldn't it? How much warning time would they have if a salvo was fired towards them?
Well, Guam's government actually put out a little statement today to its citizens giving them practical tips on what to do in case of a strike. And it mentioned they would have about 30 seconds in some cases to respond. But of course, I mean, there are wide variables here. It's not sure what could happen. I think the population there is concerned, but this is something they deal with on a pretty frequent basis. This is not new for them.
Carla, what would probably be a concern is that there is a large U.S. military presence in Guam, correct? How ready are those installations there in Guam?
Well, there are large U.S. military presences all over Asia. I mean, if you just talk about South Korea alone, there are about 30,000 U.S. troops. But U.S. Pacific Command as a whole, I don't want to go just specific to Guam, but as a whole, they are ready. They have been conducting bombing practice flights for the last few weeks. The last one was just 3 days ago with B-1 bombers. And in fact, they've also had the Japanese Air Force and the South Korean Air Force to escort their bombers as they do this run. So they are prepared in that manner. In addition to that, there are other very visual signs that the U.S. military has to be ready. The aircraft carrier out in the Pacific, they have the best of the best. Pacific Command officials were telling me right here in this theater when it comes to aircraft, for example, they have the F-22s, the stealth ones, and the new F-35 fighter jets. They have ATACMS, which can be used to strike targets, and they also have Aegis ships that have SM-3 missile destroyers. And if that wasn't enough just in that area, Alaska is where the United States becomes protected because that's where the counter ICBM equipment is, those ground-based interceptors that will take on an ICBM. Whereas some of the U.S. Equipment, THAAD, for example, the missile defense system that we use for intermediate and short-range ballistic missiles, that has been perfect so far. 15 out of 15 the U.S. has struck every time that it's been practicing. Ground-based interceptors, not quite so good. So that's what I think the U.S. is going to be focusing on for the homeland, and then also preparing, as I said, with several different options to get to the peninsula.
Bill, I guess what Carla is talking about is what the president referred to early Friday morning, I believe, when he said that U.S. military is locked and loaded. Is that what he means?
Well, it's unclear exactly what he means. I mean, the U.S. military, as Carla mentioned, is very ready for conflict. They always stay ready. I mean, we're getting ready to enter into a period of annual military exercises near North Korea, in fact, which, you know, happens every year. What does locked and loaded mean? What does fire and fury mean? It's not exactly clear.
It's all subject to interpretation, but it's not good.
It's not. And there's also an issue of who is he aiming this message at? I mean, you know, North Koreans don't have Twitter, obviously. A large part of this message may be aimed at his domestic audience.
Yeah, but speaking of the messaging, Bill, I mean, look, you've heard the ramping up and the escalation of this tough talk between Pyongyang and the United States. What's that doing to tensions in the region?
I don't think a lot of leaders in the region know exactly what to make of it. I mean, this is still somewhat of a new thing. They haven't heard a U.S. leader use this type of language and sort of you know, attempt to talk on the same level as North Korea on this particular issue. So they're kind of deciding whether to treat this seriously or whether or not Trump's words just seem to be rhetoric aimed at a domestic audience, I think.
And Carla, I guess to Bill Gallo's point, there is a camp within the White House that's trying to lower the temperature. What does Defense Secretary Mattis have to say about that? What is his tone?
Secretary Mattis has been very measured with everything that he's been saying over the past few days. When asked, is the military ready? He says, yes, we're ready. We don't need to go into further details. And then when the initial responses from the president came out, he wanted to follow with warning, basically, North Korea, you do not want to do anything that will end up destroying your regime, hurting your people, because we have overwhelming force against you. And that is kind of the language that Kim Jong-un may listen to, because while he does want that nuclear capability, he also wants his regime to last. So those are the types of messages I think that he will be understanding.
Okay, Carla, we're looking forward to your reports from that region. And thank you again, Bill Gallo, and thank you, Carla Babb. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, we continue this conversation with a look at possible military options for the U.S. and how South Koreans see the escalating war of words. This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
A total solar eclipse will happen August 21st and will be visible across all of North America. Millions of people will watch, but looking at the sun without protection can cause eye damage and requires safety glasses, such as those made by the NASA-approved American Paper Optics Company, whose president is John Jarrett.
In an hour, we can manufacture more than 50,000 glasses an hour from start to finish.
NASA officials say homemade filters or sunglasses are not safe for eclipse viewing. But for those that will see the event, it will provide quite a thrill, says NASA scientist Michelle Thaler.
You can feel it coming, you can feel the temperature dropping, you can feel things changing and getting very strange.
NASA experts say another safe way to view a solar eclipse is through pinhole projection that shows a reflected image of the sun and doesn't require looking directly into the sun's rays. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Emil Arcega in Washington. Well, Japan, as we know, is the only country to have suffered nuclear bombardment at the end of the Second World War. Now, that country is often a focus of at least the target of North Korea's rhetorical wrath. But analysts say the debate over whether Tokyo should develop its own nuclear weapons capabilities may now be moving into the political mainstream. VOA's Henry Ridgewell filed this report from the Japanese capital.
A Japanese defense paper this week echoed reported concerns among US intelligence that Pyongyang has achieved the key final step of miniaturizing nuclear warheads. Former Defense Ministry advisor Narushige Michishita.
It is possible, or quite likely even, that North Korea can attack Tokyo with nuclear weapons today. And if missiles is launched, it will reach Japan within 10 minutes.
North Korea is believed to have more than 200 missiles capable of hitting Japan. An attack on a crowded city like Tokyo would put hundreds of thousands of lives at risk. Japan's constitution allows military action only in self-defense. Hawkish conservatives, including Finance Minister Taro Aso, argue Japan should keep open the option of developing nuclear weapons. The issue is openly debated in South Korea, but polls show just 5% of Japanese want the country to be a nuclear power.
So, is fire the only way to fight fire? Well, joining us now to look at options for South Korea and the United States, we are joined here in Washington by VOA Korean Service Chief Dong-Hyuk Lee and by VOA Senior Investigative Reporter Jeffrey Young. I thank you both for joining us. Dong-Hyuk, since you are the chief of our Korea service, I want to talk to you about this. Every time this issue has come up, the reaction from South Koreans seems to be a little bit of complacency. Oh, he's done this before. Does this escalating war of words change that calculus a little bit?
Well, in the past, as you have mentioned, South Koreans have been showing a remarkable calmness to North Korea's threats, to the point of being a little bit callous even. But I think this time situations are a little bit different, and South Korea's stocks and currency have fallen, and people appear to be a little bit more worried about than before about the situation. Well, what's the difference? The difference is South Koreans are familiar with North Korea's bellicose, rhetoric and their, old-fashioned threats. But this time, President Trump has made a really strong statement and direct warning against North Korea, and that might have gotten the attention of South Koreans.
So, Jeff, you've been looking at this issue for quite some time now as our strategic asset analyst. But in terms of North Korea's nuclear capabilities, how far along have they come? Are they as advanced as some of the media seems to be suggesting?
They have yet to launch a device or detonate a device underground that is in excess of roughly 20 kilotons. Mm-hmm. And what they need for a effective warhead, if they want to compare it to the United States, would be in the range of 330 to 470 kilotons. This is what we have. The Russians have warheads as big as 20 megatons, but that's for different purposes. But for North Korea's use.
But regardless of the size of that, Jeff, okay. I mean, do they have the capability to reach the mainland United States?
When you look at missiles, when you look at range, you have an inverse relationship between the weight of the missile and the weight of the payload and the range of the missile. The heavier the payload, the heavier the missile, the shorter the range. So the problem with North Korea at this point, technically, is that they have not been able to build an effective warhead that, yes, can fit on a missile and deliver a big enough payload that has an effective detonation to reach the United States. They don't have something light enough to be carried far enough. Right. And this is where the inverse relationship so far is protecting the United States. But the clock is ticking.
Yes, it is. And Dong-hyuk, the reason why we're talking about this and speculating about what might happen is because the president, after his fire and fury comments, actually doubled down on those comments, suggesting that he should have been tougher against Pyongyang. Are South Koreans worried about this kind of back and forth between the United States and Pyongyang?
I would say so. If you go back to what happened in April, when President Trump met with President Xi Jinping of China, President Trump ordered the airstrikes on Syria, mm-hmm. which made huge news in South Korea, which has rattled the South Korean market at the time. So now the South Korean press is comparing that situation to the latest development. So yes, they are worried about what is going on right now between Washington and Pyongyang. Yeah.
So Jeffrey, what kinds of options are available to the United States? How do we fight back against this threat?
Well, they stack in this order. The first one is a preemptive pad attack. In other words, the United States destroys the missiles on the pad before the missiles are launched. This obviously is an act of war in anyone's definition under international law. That's option number one. The second option would be to use the Aegis missile defense system. We have vessels from the United States Pacific Fleet that are deployable on either side of the Korean coast, so that if the missiles are fired from either the west or the east side, the Aegis system works in what's called exo-atmosphere. A missile has a trajectory. When the missile exits the atmosphere and before its re-entry, that's when Aegis can hit it. Aegis has a roughly 75 to 80% success rate on ship-fired missiles. That is option number two. Option number three would be what's called THAAD, which is the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. THAAD is already deployed to Guam. The deployment happened in April of 2013. THAAD is, according to Lockheed Martin, its manufacturer, a 100% success rate. So that leaves you the options with a fourth, and that is the most dangerous one, and that is leadership decapitation.
We can talk about that a little bit further because that's getting really into speculative territory. But I want to talk to you, Dong-hyuk, about THAAD. I know that was a political issue during the last presidential elections. Do South Koreans have faith in the effectiveness of THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System?
Well, I think among experts and even among the public, I think there seems to be split opinions and split views. There are some people who believe that the system is capable enough, to deter North Korea's missiles and defend South Korea from North Korea's missile threats. At the same time, there are some experts who are still remain sort of skeptical whether the system is really able to defend South Korea from North Korea's threats.
Jeffrey, you just mentioned this. What's the possibility there of other options? You suggested decapitation of leadership. Is that a realistic thing to is that something that we would look at aside from, say, a preemptive strike?
When we did endless games theory in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, we looked at leadership decapitation. In fact, we even did some research into what it would take to be able to take out leadership bunkers and remove the leadership of an adversary. The problem with this, and this is very important for people to consider, you have to have someone to turn off the war. If you decapitate the leadership, you are automatically guaranteeing what is called a second responsive strike.
I assume that North Koreans have already looked at that possibility. I thank you, Dong-Yuk and Jeffrey Young. We're going to take another break right now, but when we come back, our final segment on North Korea this week takes a look at the historical and political consequences of the escalating rhetoric between the U.S. and North Korea. But first, a reminder, we do want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back. Thank you, Dr.
This is BizBeat.
A tilt of a smartphone controls the movement of the spine, or the larger version hyperboard, essentially a glorified skateboard with an electric motor. Tilt up to go forward, tilt back to stop.
So this is an electric skateboard. It's 3D printed. It's a prototype from Faraday Motion. It works with the mobile phone.
Soon Peterson is the CEO of Faraday Motion, a Berlin startup that builds and designs platforms that make small electric vehicles to fill the gaps of transport between your home and the bus stop, or from the office to the train, or the final mile of a destination. Cars are becoming autonomous, and he believes small motor movers are coming.
We want to enable people to have the specific form factors that is just the perfect fit for their needs.
500 euros gets you a kit to make your own vehicle, but you'll need a home-based 3D printer, becoming more available every day. The spine has a 10-kilometer range and moves 30 kilometers an hour. For VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, after 7 months of relative calm, President Donald Trump is now facing what may be his greatest foreign policy challenge to date. What to do with a belligerent and nuclear-capable North Korea. But the test comes in the wake of recent polling showing the president's political standing here at home greatly weakened. VOA national correspondent Jim Malone has our report.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Trump's remarks were unfortunate, says former Ambassador Bill Richardson.
Now I think the president has a chance to rally the nation, to address the country on what our policy is, but most importantly, to calm down.
President Obama, he is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS.
Americans got used to Trump's tough rhetoric during last year's election campaign. But now that he's president, the standard is different, says political analyst Larry Sabato via Skype.
He is very impulsive. Now, I suppose you could argue that abroad, that may be a plus when your enemies, when your adversaries think they're dealing with someone who doesn't exactly have a cool head. On the other hand, when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, I'd say it was in everybody's interest, including America's interest, to have someone with a cool head.
But Trump defenders say the blunt warning is what his supporters expect.
So what happens when campaign rhetoric meets international reality? Joining us now to talk more about this, we are joined by VOA national correspondent Jim Malone. Jim Malone, I thank you for helping us out. This is a very sobering topic, but we need to talk about it. President Trump, obviously, rather than softening his fire and fury comments, he seems to be doubling down on that, and he's using loaded words like locked and loaded, we should have been tougher, that sort of thing. Is that a wise tactic politically?
Well, I think it certainly has stirred concern in the international community. It has stirred concern from Democrats, some pushback from Democrats. On the other hand, some Republicans are coming to his defense. Lindsey Graham, no one who's shy to criticize the president thinks the president's rhetoric is generally appropriate because, look, and Trump has made this point himself, predecessors have not been able to deal with the North Korean threat. He is vowing to try to do that, but the language is strong and it is making a number of people uneasy. And also you have this idea of the mixed messages in the administration. where the Secretary of State uses softer language. So that's where we're at.
Because, I mean, you followed the campaign for months. It's kind of a winning strategy when you're talking to your domestic audience, right? I mean, they like to rah-rah.
Well,
but
this is him from the campaign. The question for some is, has he made the transition from saying things on the stump as a candidate, blunt threats, to, okay, you're president now, people are much more interested in what you have to say in detail?
A casual observer would suggest that he has not.
Well, he is. I think the key here is, like with everything that Mr. Trump does, he wants to follow through on being someone who wants to drain the swamp in Washington and upend politics as usual. If you adopt that philosophy, in a way, anything goes. And we have the Trump experience as a businessman, negotiate from a position of strength, sometimes make embellished arguments or claims. You want to be in a position of strength so that you can negotiate something so that you can win. That's the background philosophy.
But Jim Malone is the president operating from a position of strength. I mean, if you to believe the latest polls, 3 out of 4 Americans don't really believe what the White House is saying.
Yeah, this is for the White House, perhaps the unfortunate backdrop here is his support has been sliding. Part of it has to do with the stalled legislative agenda. We've seen the health care thing come unraveled. But also, if you look into these polls, there is an issue of credibility. And that is something that continues to haunt the White House. In some cases, well under 40% of people say the president is honest or trustworthy. That's a consistent theme. And the question is, if you're dealing with an international crisis, and this is his first big international test as president, to what extent does the fact that people may not totally believe you, how does that potentially undermine what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say?
Okay, so Jim Malone, previous presidents have usually dealt with the issue of Pyongyang through a proxy, another country perhaps criticizing the country, but have never dealt directly with Kim Jong-un. By doing that, does he raise Kim Jong-un's profile to the same level as a U.S. president?
Well, he may, but I think it's mostly about how he sees his own profile. I think he sees it's very much eccentric to what he does. He's at the center of the universe here politically, and it's most important what he says. You have a number of administration people come out later and try to explain what is being said or try to tamp down the comments. But at the end of the day, they're generally deferential to the commander-in-chief. He was the one who was elected. He was the beneficiary of this revolution to come to power.
So given this ramping up of this rhetoric, does he leave himself any room for a diplomatic solution?
Well, I'm sure in his own mind, it's probably true, because he thinks you start from a position of strength and therefore the other side will eventually get the message and will back off. But look at how other presidents have dealt with things like that. George H.W. Bush, the Persian Gulf War, said very little. And yet was very strong and consistent, as were the people under him in the run-up to that war. This is a much different sort of case example of a president facing a foreign policy crisis.
I got like 15 seconds left, Jim Malone. Do you see comparisons here between the 1962 missile crisis with Cuba?
Well, there are some, although certainly the Soviet threat was much more encompassing. So in that sense, hopefully, sobering minds will prevail.
Never a dull moment here in Washington. That's Jim Malone, thank you so much. And of course, to all our correspondents today, that is our show. Please join us again next week for the final edition of the Correspondents. But before we go, we want to mention that iconic country and pop singer Glen Campbell, also a star of stage and screen, died this week on August 8th at the age of 81. His death comes after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. One of the biggest stars of the late 1960s and 70s, Campbell sold more than 45 million records and had 12 gold albums. Glen Campbell, the Rhinestone Cowboy, 81. I'm Millar Sega. Thank you for joining us.
Let's hear you loud, like a rhinestone cowboy. Oh yeah, riding out on a horse in a star-spangled road, like a rhinestone cowboy. Yeah. Through cupped hands round the tin can, I pretend to hold you to my breast and find